From eating bananas with a knife and fork to traveling with half-eaten chocolate cake in a tin, Queen Elizabeth II's dining habits were as fascinating as they were unexpected. Behind palace walls, the monarch followed centuries-old superstitions about sandwich shapes, insisted on reviewing menus written in French, and maintained strict protocols that could leave dinner guests hungry if they ate too slowly. While she ruled over state banquets featuring the finest cuisine, Her Majesty herself preferred simple fare and had some surprisingly unusual methods for consuming everyday foods. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Queen Elizabeth II meals. Fact 1. Bananas eaten like royalty, not monkeys. Queen Elizabeth II never ate a banana the way most people do. While the rest of us simply peel back the skin and take a bite, the Queen followed a much more elaborate process that her former chef Darren McGrady described in detail. First, she would use a knife to slice off both ends of the banana. Then, she would carefully make a lengthwise cut through the peel without damaging the fruit inside. After peeling away the skin completely and discarding it, she would place the naked banana on her plate and proceed to cut it into small coin-shaped slices. Only then would she pick up her fork and eat each individual piece one at a time. McGrady explained that this meticulous method existed for a very specific reason, and it had everything to do with maintaining royal dignity. The Queen believed that eating a banana by hand with the peel still attached made a person look like a monkey. For someone who spent her entire life in the public eye and was constantly being photographed at official functions, maintaining proper etiquette at all times was absolutely essential. This banana eating technique wasn't just a personal quirk either. It was part of the broader royal dining etiquette that the entire family was expected to follow. The method ensured that no member of the royal family would ever be caught in an undignified moment while enjoying their fruit. While it might seem incredibly excessive to most people, for Queen Elizabeth, it was simply the proper way to eat a banana, and she never wavered from this practice throughout her entire life. Fact 2. Pears consumed like boiled eggs. The royal family had an equally unusual method for eating pears, and it was just as elaborate as their banana technique. According to royal insiders and former palace staff, when Queen Elizabeth and her family ate pears, they didn't simply bite into them or cut them into slices the way most people would. Instead, they treated the pear exactly like a soft-boiled egg. The process began by slicing off the top of the pear, creating a flat opening at the stem end. Then, using a teaspoon, they would carefully scoop out the soft flesh from the inside, eating it bit by bit until only the skin and core remained. Former royal chef Darren McGrady confirmed this peculiar practice and added another fascinating detail about the palace's pear procurement process. The royal kitchens would order 200 pears at a time, not because the family ate that many, but because the chefs needed to have enough options to hand-select only the perfectly ripened specimens. Pears are notoriously tricky fruits because they ripen quickly and have a very short window when they're at peak texture and flavor. Too hard and they're grainy and flavorless. Too soft and they become mushy and unpleasant. By ordering such a large quantity, the chefs could examine each pear individually and choose only those that had reached that perfect moment of ripeness for the Queen's table. The rest would be used in cooking or given to staff, ensuring nothing went to waste while guaranteeing that Her Majesty only ever experienced pears at their absolute best. Fact 3. The traveling chocolate cake. Obsession. Queen Elizabeth II had many refined tastes, but one of her favorite treats was surprisingly simple. She absolutely loved chocolate biscuit cake, a no-bake dessert made from crushed cookies and chocolate that's more about texture than fancy ingredients. According to her former chef, Darren McGrady, who worked for the royal family for 15 years, this wasn't just a casual preference. The Queen was genuinely devoted to this particular cake. McGrady revealed that whenever he made a chocolate biscuit cake for Her Majesty, she would eat a small slice of it every single day until the entire cake was completely finished. She wouldn't allow anyone to throw it away or replace it with a fresh one. She wanted to eat that specific cake until it was gone. This obsession created a logistical challenge when the Queen traveled between residences. The royal family frequently moved between Buckingham Palace in London and Windsor Castle in Berkshire, and the Queen expected to continue eating her cake regardless of location. McGrady shared an amusing anecdote about how he would handle this situation. He would carefully place the half-eaten chocolate biscuit cake into a tin, board a train from London to Windsor, and make the entire journey with the tin balanced on his knee to keep it steady and prevent damage. He couldn't risk putting it in luggage where it might get jostled or crushed. The cake had to arrive in perfect condition so the Queen could enjoy her next slice. This dedication to a simple chocolate biscuit cake showed a surprisingly down-to-earth side of the monarch, proving that even someone who lived in palaces and wore priceless crowns could have humble comfort foods they treasured. Fact 4. Square sandwiches were banned. Superstition. If you ever had the opportunity to dine with Queen Elizabeth II, you would have noticed something unusual about the sandwiches served at her table. Every single sandwich had its corners cut off, creating a rounded or oval shape instead of the traditional square or rectangular form. This wasn't a matter of aesthetics or a modern culinary trend. It was actually rooted in a centuries-old royal superstition about treason and death. Former royal chef Darren McGrady explained that square or rectangular sandwiches were strictly forbidden because their shape too closely resembled a coffin. In royal circles, serving someone a coffin-shaped food item was considered an ominous symbol, suggesting that you wished ill upon them or even hoped for their death. For a monarch, this symbolism carried even darker implications. A coffin-shaped sandwich could be interpreted as a symbolic gesture of treason, essentially suggesting that you wanted to overthrow or harm the throne. Given the long history of actual plots, assassinations, and political intrigue that had plagued British royalty for centuries, these superstitions weren't taken lightly. The tradition of cutting off sandwich corners predates Queen Elizabeth and goes back generations in the royal family. McGrady noted that this rule applied to all sandwiches served to the Queen. Whether they were simple cucumber sandwiches for afternoon tea or more elaborate options for luncheons, the chefs had to be meticulous about ensuring every sandwich that allowed a square sandwich to reach the Queen's table would have been considered a serious breach of protocol. While modern people might find this superstition amusing or excessive for the royal household, it was simply part of maintaining tradition and showing proper respect for the monarch. Fact 5. Everyone stops eating. When she stops, one of the most strictly enforced rules of royal dining etiquette could leave guests absolutely starving if they weren't careful about their eating pace. The protocol was simple, but unforgiving. When Queen Elizabeth II finished her meal and put down her cutlery, everyone else at the table had to immediately stop eating as well, regardless of how much food remained on their plates. This wasn't a suggestion or a polite custom that could be bent under certain circumstances. It was an absolute rule that applied to everyone, from visiting dignitaries and heads of state to her own family members. The moment the Queen placed her knife and fork together on her plate in the finished position, dinner was over for everyone. Former royal staff members have shared stories about guests who learned this lesson the hard way. Slow eaters who spent too much time talking or who took small, leisurely bites would suddenly find themselves with half a plate of food remaining when the Queen finished. At that point, they had no choice but to set down their utensils and accept that their meal was done. Palace footmen would quickly move in to clear the plates, leaving the unfortunate diner hungry for the rest of the evening. The Queen herself was reportedly a relatively quick eater, which compounded the problem for those who weren't prepared. Some regular guests at royal dinners learned to keep a close eye on Her Majesty's progress through her meal and adjust their own pace accordingly. Prince Philip was known to be one of the fastest eaters at the table, often finishing well before his wife and then waiting patiently for everyone else. The rule existed as a mark of respect for the monarch, ensuring that she was never kept waiting at her own table and maintaining the formal structure of royal occasions. Fact 6. Prairie tea with the corgis. Queen Elizabeth II didn't start her day the way most people do. Before she ever sat down to a proper breakfast, she had what the palace staff called a pre-ref, a smaller meal that she enjoyed in the privacy of her bedroom. This morning, ritual began at 7:30 in the morning when a tray would be brought to her room containing a pot of Earl Grey tea with no milk and no sugar along with a selection of biscuits. According to former royal correspondent Gordon Renner and various palace insiders, this wasn't just about having a light snack before breakfast. It was a cherished personal routine that the Queen followed consistently throughout her adult life. The pre-break was also a special time she shared with her beloved Pembroke Welsh Corgis, the breed of dog she famously adored and bred throughout her reign. While she sipped her tea and nibbled on biscuits, her corgis would often be in the room with her, and she would sometimes share treats with them during these quiet morning moments. This private time allowed her to ease into the day before facing the official duties and public appearances that would fill her schedule. After finishing her pre-ref, she would then have her actual breakfast, which typically consisted of cereal from a Tupperware container she kept in her room along with toast and marmalade. The distinction between pre-break and breakfast might seem unnecessary to most people, but for someone whose life was rigidly scheduled and constantly attended by staff, these small personal rituals provided a sense of normalcy and comfort. The Earl Grey tea tradition was one she maintained for decades, and palace staff knew never to alter the preparation. It had to be Earl Grey. It had to be plain with no additions, and it had to arrive at precisely 7:30. Fact 7. Random plate selection prevents poisoning. Throughout history, monarchs have faced the constant threat of assassination, and poisoning has always been one of the most feared methods because it can be difficult to detect and prevent. Royal families traditionally employed food tasters, people whose job was to sample the monarch's food before it was served to ensure it wasn't poisoned. If the taster fell ill or died, the food was obviously unsafe. However, Queen Elizabeth II's security team took a more modern and clever approach to this age-old problem. According to royal protection experts and former palace staff, the Queen didn't have a designated food taster in the traditional sense. Instead, the palace implemented a random selection system that made poisoning effectively impossible without catastrophic consequences. Here's how it worked. After the royal chefs prepared a meal, they would create multiple identical plates of food. All the plates looked exactly the same with the same portions and the same presentation. Then, moments before serving, a page or member of the security staff would randomly select one of those plates to serve to the Queen. The key word here is random. No one, not even the chefs themselves, knew which specific plate would end up in front of Her Majesty until the very last moment. This system created a brilliant deterrent against poisoning because anyone attempting to harm the Queen would have to poison every single plate of food, not just one. And if they poisoned all the plates, they would inevitably poison other members of the royal family, staff, or guests, creating immediate evidence of foul play and triggering a massive investigation. The randomness made targeted assassination through food virtually impossible. This security measure was kept relatively quiet during the Queen's lifetime, as discussing assassination protocols too openly could provide useful information to potential threats. However, since her death, security experts have revealed this clever system as an example of how modern royal protection adapted traditional methods for contemporary needs. Fact 8. Scones served daily but fed to dogs. Queen Elizabeth II had very specific requirements for her afternoon tea, and one of her most consistent demands involved scones. According to her former chef Darren McGrady, the Queen insisted that scones be served every single day as part of her afternoon tea service. Not only that, but she required variety. The kitchen staff had to alternate between plain scones and fruit scones, ensuring that she never had the same type 2 days in a row. The chefs took this requirement seriously, carefully tracking which type had been served the previous day to maintain the proper rotation. Fresh scones would be baked each afternoon, filling the palace kitchens with the warm, buttery aroma of one of Britain's most traditional tea time treats. The scones would be placed on elegant serving plates alongside clotted cream and jam, presented exactly as tradition dictated. Everything appeared perfect and proper following centuries of British tea culture. Despite insisting that scones be served daily and that they alternate between varieties, Queen Elizabeth herself almost never actually ate them. McGrady revealed that the Queen had a surprising habit of taking the scones from the tea service and feeding them to her beloved corgis instead. The dogs would eagerly wait during afternoon tea, knowing that treats were coming their way. While the Queen enjoyed her tea and the tiny crustless sandwiches that accompanied it, the scones were essentially dog treats disguised as refined afternoon tea items. This quirky behavior raises an interesting question about why she insisted on the daily scone service if she wasn't going to eat them herself. The most likely explanation is that scones were simply an expected part of proper afternoon tea presentation. And the Queen maintained these traditions even when they didn't align with her personal preferences. Appearances and protocol mattered in royal life. So the scones had to be there freshly baked and properly varied whether or not she intended to consume them. Fact 9. Menus written in French. Since 1066, every week, Queen Elizabeth II would receive a red leather-bound book containing all the menus for her upcoming meals. But if you looked inside this book, you wouldn't find anything written in English. Every single menu from breakfast through dinner, from simple family meals to elaborate state banquets, was written entirely in French. This wasn't a modern affectation or a pretentious choice by her chefs. It was actually a tradition that dated back more than 900 years to the Norman conquest of England in 1066. When William the Conqueror invaded England and established Norman rule, French became the language of the royal court and remained so for centuries. Even after English gradually returned as the dominant language of Britain, French continued to hold a special place in royal protocol, particularly regarding food and dining. The tradition persisted through the centuries, and by Queen Elizabeth's reign, it was simply the way things had always been done. Former royal chef Darren McGrady, who prepared these weekly menu books for 15 years, explained that writing the menus in French was non-negotiable. But the Queen didn't just passively accept whatever was written. She actively reviewed every menu with great attention to detail. McGrady revealed that if he made any grammatical errors in his French, whether it was an incorrect accent mark, a misspelled word, or using the wrong masculine or feminine form of a noun, the Queen would catch it and mark the mistake. She would cross out errors and make corrections before approving the menus. This showed not only her fluency in French, but also her exacting standards and attention to detail. For the palace chefs, this meant they had to maintain their French language skills just as carefully as their culinary abilities. A perfectly conceived menu could still be sent back for corrections if the grammar wasn't impeccable. Fact 10. Daily pre-launch. Gin and Dubet cocktail. Queen Elizabeth II had a very specific drinking routine, and it started before lunch each day with a particular cocktail that she enjoyed for decades. According to multiple sources, including her cousin Margaret Rodas and various palace staff members, the Queen would have a gin and Dubet cocktail before her midday meal. The recipe was precise. 2 parts Dubet, which is a sweet wine-based aperitif with herbs and spices mixed with 1 part Gordon's gin served with a slice of lemon and ice. This wasn't a habit she developed on her own. She actually inherited this particular drink preference from her mother, the Queen Mother, who was famously fond of gin and lived to the impressive age of 101. The Queen Mother reportedly enjoyed this same cocktail and passed the tradition down to her daughter. Dubet itself has an interesting history. It was originally created in 1846 by French chemist Joseph Dubinet, who was responding to a competition launched by the French government to find a way to make quinine more palatable. Quinine was used to fight malaria in French colonial troops, but it tasted extremely bitter on its own. Dubet's solution was to mix quinine with wine, herbs, and spices, creating an aperitif that made the medicine easier to consume while also tasting pleasant enough to drink recreationally. The drink became popular in France and eventually spread to Britain, where it found favor among the upper classes and ultimately the royal family. For Queen Elizabeth, this daily pre-launch cocktail was a modest indulgence in an otherwise disciplined life. Some reports over the years suggested she drank multiple alcoholic beverages throughout the day, but her former chef, Darren McGrady, pushed back against these claims, insisting they were exaggerated and that she would be pickled if such reports were true. However, the pre-launch gin and Dubet was a confirmed part of her daily routine for most of her adult life. Fact 11. Brown eggs taste better than white. Queen Elizabeth II had very firm opinions about her food, and one of her most interesting preferences involved eggs. According to former royal chef Darren McGrady and other palace insiders, the Queen would only eat brown eggs for breakfast. She refused to have white eggs served to her because she genuinely believed that brown eggs tasted better. This preference was absolute and non-negotiable. The palace kitchens had standing orders to source only brown eggs for Her Majesty's breakfast table. Here's the fascinating part. From a scientific and culinary standpoint, there is absolutely no difference in taste, nutrition, or quality between brown eggs and white eggs. The color of an eggshell is determined entirely by the breed of chicken that laid it. Chickens with white earlobes tend to lay white eggs, while chickens with red or brown earlobes tend to lay brown eggs. The shell color has nothing to do with what the chicken ate, how it was raised, or the quality of the egg inside. If you conducted a blind taste test using a white egg and a brown egg from chickens raised under identical conditions, even expert tasters couldn't reliably tell them apart. The flavor, texture, and nutritional content are essentially the same. Yet, the Queen maintained this preference throughout her life, convinced that brown eggs were superior. This belief likely stemmed from perception rather than reality. In Britain, brown eggs have historically been associated with farm-fresh free-range production, while white eggs were often linked to industrial farming. This association created a psychological connection where brown eggs seemed more natural, wholesome, and higher quality, even though the reality was much more complex. Additionally, brown eggs tend to cost slightly more than white eggs in stores. Not because they're better, but simply because the breeds that lay brown eggs are often larger birds that require more feed. This price difference may have reinforced the perception that brown eggs were premium products. No food eaten by hand except tea. Queen Elizabeth II was raised with strict Victorian etiquette, and one of the most fundamental rules she followed throughout her life was that food should never be eaten with your hands. According to former royal staff and people who dined with the Queen, she refused to pick up food items and bite into them the way most people do. Everything had to be eaten with proper cutlery using a knife and fork whenever possible. This rule applied to foods that most people would consider perfectly acceptable to eat by hand. Chicken legs, pizza slices, French fries, and even hamburgers were all consumed using utensils at the Queen's table. Former chef Darren McGrady specifically mentioned that when hamburgers were served, the Queen would remove the bun entirely and then cut the burger patty into small pieces with a knife and fork, eating each piece individually. The idea of picking up a burger with both hands and taking a bite was completely out of the question. This level of formality extended to nearly every food item, creating some situations that would look quite unusual to anyone unfamiliar with royal dining customs. However, there was one notable exception to this rule. During afternoon tea, the Queen would eat small finger sandwiches and other finger foods by hand. This was considered acceptable because afternoon tea had its own distinct set of etiquette rules that specifically allowed for certain items to be picked up with your fingers. Tea sandwiches are traditionally made to be consumed this way, with the crusts cut off and the sandwiches cut into small triangles or rectangles that can be eaten in 1 or 2 bites. Scones, though she rarely ate them herself, were also meant to be broken apart by hand during tea service. The distinction came down to context and tradition. Formal meals required formal utensils, but afternoon tea followed different conventions that had been established over centuries of British tea culture. Fact 13. Garlic completely banned from palace. Queen Elizabeth II had many food preferences, but few were as absolute as her hatred of garlic. According to multiple sources, including former royal chefs and palace staff members, garlic was completely banned from Buckingham Palace kitchens whenever the Queen was dining. This wasn't a mild dislike or a preference to use less garlic in recipes. It was a total prohibition. No dish prepared for Her Majesty could contain even a trace of garlic. Former chef Darren McGrady confirmed this rule and explained the reasoning behind it. The Queen considered garlic to be antisocial because of its strong lingering odor. When you eat garlic, your body metabolizes the sulfur compounds and releases them through your breath and even your skin for hours afterward. For someone who constantly met with people, participated in public events, attended diplomatic functions, and conducted official business, having garlic breath was simply unacceptable. She couldn't risk offending someone with a noticeable odor during a royal engagement or official photograph. This garlic ban created challenges for the palace chefs, especially when preparing dishes that traditionally rely on garlic as a fundamental ingredient. Mediterranean, Italian, French, and many Asian cuisines use garlic extensively, and removing it from recipes meant fundamentally altering the intended flavor profiles. Chefs had to find creative substitutes and workarounds to maintain interesting and flavorful meals without using the forbidden ingredient. Interestingly, the ban only applied when the Queen herself was eating. Prince Philip, her husband, was apparently allowed to enjoy garlic when he dined outside the palace or at events where the Queen wasn't present. This suggests the restriction was specifically about her personal preferences and her need to maintain a certain public presentation rather than a blanket rule for the entire royal family. The garlic ban remained in effect throughout her entire reign, from her coronation in 1953 until her death in 2022, meaning palace chefs went nearly 70 years without using garlic in the Queen's meals. Fact 14. Seasonal food enforced, year-round. Queen Elizabeth II was remarkably strict about eating only seasonal produce, and she enforced this rule with an iron will. According to her former chefs, the Queen would review her weekly menus personally, and if any chef dared to suggest a fruit or vegetable that was out of season, she would immediately cross it out and reject the entire menu proposal. This wasn't about health concerns or nutritional preferences. It was about principle and tradition. The Queen believed strongly that food should be eaten when it naturally grows in Britain, not when it's imported from other countries or produced in greenhouses using artificial methods. Former chef Darren McGrady shared specific examples of this policy in action. If a chef suggested serving strawberries in January when they don't naturally grow in the British climate, the Queen would reject the idea without hesitation. It didn't matter that strawberries could easily be imported from warmer countries where they were in season, or that greenhouse cultivation could produce them year-round. The Queen simply refused to eat produce that wasn't naturally available during that particular month in Britain. This extended to all fruits and vegetables, creating a rotating menu that strictly followed the British growing calendar. Spring meant asparagus and early greens. Summer brought berries and stone fruits. Autumn featured apples and root vegetables, and winter required reliance on stored crops and preserved items. The rule also applied to genetically modified foods, which the Queen refused to eat under any circumstances. She preferred organic produce grown on her own royal estates whenever possible, believing it to be more natural and wholesome than commercially produced alternatives. Interestingly, there's an ironic twist to this strict seasonal eating policy. Despite her insistence that menus only include seasonal British produce, the Queen herself often didn't actually eat very much of the food that was prepared for her. Multiple sources have noted that she was a light eater with simple tastes who often preferred plain, basic dishes over elaborate preparations. Fact 15. Champagne Nightcap. Every evening, Queen Elizabeth II's drinking habits were the subject of much speculation and sometimes wild claims over the years, with some reports suggesting she consumed 4 or more alcoholic beverages every single day. Her former chef, Darren McGrady, strongly disputed these exaggerated accounts, insisting that if such reports were true, she'd be pickled from the sheer amount of alcohol. However, one drinking habit that was confirmed by multiple reliable sources was her nightly champagne ritual. According to people close to the Queen, including family members and palace staff, she would end nearly every day with a glass of champagne as her regular nightcap after dinner. This wasn't an occasional indulgence or something she did part of her evening routine that she maintained for decades. The champagne nightcap represented a small moment of relaxation at the end of long days filled with official duties, public appearances, paperwork, and diplomatic responsibilities. For someone whose life was so heavily scheduled and scrutinized, having this predictable personal ritual provided a sense of normalcy and comfort. The choice of champagne specifically is interesting because it's traditionally associated with celebrations and special occasions. Yet for the Queen, it became an everyday pleasure. She reportedly preferred vintage champagne from prestigious houses served properly chilled in appropriate glassware. This wasn't about drinking to excess or using alcohol to cope with stress. It was about maintaining a civilized, elegant routine that had been part of her life since her early adulthood. The Queen's mother, the Queen Mother, was also known for enjoying her drinks, and some of these habits were clearly passed down through generations. The combination of the daily pre-launch gin and Dubet cocktail, occasional wine with meals, and the evening champagne nightcap added up to a moderate but consistent alcohol consumption that the Queen apparently maintained well into her 90s without any apparent negative health effects.